This tutorial is for both English 1 and English 102 students. This tutorial will cover how to evaluate sources that you find on the internet. There are separate videos which you can access in the video tutorial section for how to access the library or Learning Commons databases, and there is another tutorial for some beginning tips and overview of the research process. This is the third video that I'm doing about research in some form, and so this one will cover specifically types of sources and how to determine whether or not you should use a source. What I have pulled up on the screen right now is a website through Boston College. This just is one of the many resources that I found when I was preparing to shoot this tutorial of guides for how to evaluate internet resources. So there are tons of these. This just happens to be the one I chose. Most of them you will find what they do is they break down different categories that you should look at when you're assessing a website. So we will get to these, but first what I want to do is talk about types of sources. And I'm going to switch over to Blackboard. Now this is the 102 shell of Blackboard, but 101, yours has the same section, so the screen will look different, but you can find the same resources. Underneath additional links, which is one of your choices over here on the left, there's a folder that is specifically labeled Research Help. So there are a lot of resources here that are great for you to look over that you may find really useful. One of the things I want to make you aware of when you choose Research Help is we have a ton of resources available through our Learning Commons. They have put together some library guides that are very, very useful, and I have linked to several of them. So the one I want to mention in this tutorial is this guide to source types. So this takes you to a guide that our Learning Commons staff prepared where they explain in more detail than I will in this tutorial what different kinds of sources are and what the differences are. Right now, the main thing that I want to differentiate between are what we call scholarly sources and essentially everything else. That's a big, obviously, catch-all category, but for the purposes of this, that will get us started. A scholarly source, which is also sometimes called peer-reviewed, those terms are used interchangeably, has to do with how something is published. When you hear scholarly, you tend to think, oh, a scholar wrote it, it's a smart person, and yes, that's typically true. But a smart person, a person with a PhD, a very qualified, educated expert can write something and it still not be considered a scholarly source. So it has to do with where it was published. So let's say I am a PhD in history. I know a lot about the Civil War. That's my specialty. If I create a website and I have all this information on my website about my work that I have done researching the Civil War, hopefully that stuff is all credible, but that website would not be scholarly. However, there are scholarly journals, also called peer-reviewed journals, that I could put the same exact information that I put on my website, but it would be considered scholarly. So the difference is, why they call it peer-reviewed is to be scholarly. Okay, what that means is that before the article, it's usually an article, was published in these particular publications. There's some that are scholarly, some that are not. It was reviewed by peers, meaning if I'm a PhD, if I'm a historian, it was reviewed by other historians before it was published. That means it went through a process where other people had to approve it before it could ever appear in that journal. If I have a website, I can put anything I want on that website. No one can stop me. There's no oversight. There's no one, unless I have a boss who is overseeing my website, no one can stop me. I can publish in an editorial if a newspaper or magazine will accept it. If I run a magazine, Yes, I probably, if I'm the editor of the magazine, I have to approve what is published, but that doesn't mean that I'm an expert. That doesn't mean that I'm fact-checking things the way that I should. So when we say something is scholarly, that means it is a very specific kind of source. It means it is published in a scholarly publication. Now, you can find some scholarly publications on the internet, like through a Google search. I'm going to switch back to the browser. However, that's not a guarantee. There are some that are available, but your best bet for finding a scholarly source is going through our Learning Commons. So to do that, you would go through, off our Blackboard, go to the direct link to the library databases that I have here, go to find articles, and then you would need to work through these databases. Some of them are all scholarly. Most of them you have to check a box to say that you only want scholarly sources. So that's what scholarly are. Just a general Google search, you're unlikely to find that many scholarly sources. So that's what that means. That is, if you go to EBSCO and you check the box that you only want scholarly sources and you search and you find some, you may disagree with it. It may not be something you end up using in your essay, but you don't have to worry about whether it's credible or not. Anything you find through the databases, through our Learning Commons, so anything that you access through one of these databases, again, you may disagree with it. Some of it is certainly better than others. But in terms of, wow, this is just made up, this is going to make me look bad, this is not reputable, credible information, you're probably not going to have to worry about. So that's why I recommend you use the databases through the Learning Commons, because then you don't have to do any of this evaluating, or you have to do very little of it. It's when you go to a general search. So when you go to a search engine, now I use Google, you may use Yahoo, whatever, Bing, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we'll use Google. When I go to Google, and the example I'm going to use is the topic of homelessness, and I type in homelessness, I get 5 million results. Now, some of these are going to be great. Some of them are not going to be great. And that is the downside of online research. You have so much information, which is wonderful, stuff that we never had access to before, but mixed in is a lot of stuff that sounds good, looks good, but may not be accurate. So that's why you get into this very tricky world of having to decide, should I use this or not? And that's what I want to focus on in this tutorial, is how do I decide? When I don't know what a website is, when I've never heard of it, how do I know whether I should use that in my paper? Because if you use it in your paper, it's going to reflect back on you. It's going to be associated with you. So if it's a bad source, it makes you look bad. And from a very practical standpoint, if you're using weak, questionable, non-credible sources, it's going to affect your grade in a negative way. So there are a lot of reasons why you should be very critical and skeptical about the sources that you find online. So once you do this general search, and I just use homelessness, now you're going to recognize some of it, okay? Like you recognize Wikipedia, I'm sure, and I have in the other tutorial about how to conduct research, I have a discussion on Wikipedia, so if you haven't watched that, you might want to go. It's at the end of the video. You might want to go check that out for how Wikipedia is useful and how it's not. But you may see some other things that you recognize, like this is HUD. This is a government website having to do with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So you probably recognize that. This is the Department of Health and Human Services. So, there's going to be government websites that you might recognize. So there will be things that are familiar. And if I click on additional pages in my research here, again, here's another government website through Virginia. Here's PBS. You've probably heard of PBS. So, there's going to be things that you've heard of. There's going to be government organizations, newspapers, magazines that you know about, or at least you're familiar with them. And so those are the things where you don't have to worry as much, like, should I use this? You may decide not to use it because it doesn't have what you need. But in terms of this is not credible, this is not accurate information, you don't have to worry as much, because you have some ability to trust these organizations or these publications that you've heard of. So again, not really talking about that. If you've heard of it, again, you know what it is, you know it has a good reputable reputation, then you can use it and not worry. If you're ever unsure, you can ask. But it's the stuff that you haven't heard of. I've never heard of NCHV, National Coalition for the Homeless, or for Homeless Veterans. I've never heard of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. Maybe I don't know what Homeless World Cup is. So these may be wonderful websites with great information, or they may be completely illegitimate with lots of inaccurate information. So that's where you want to get into, how do I evaluate them? So most of these guides to how to evaluate websites break it down into category. So just to give you an overview, authority. So that has to do with who authored this. Can you tell who the author is? What are their credentials? Now, this particular Boston College website has some, shorthand for the .com, .org. A .gov is a government resource. A .edu is affiliated with some kind of college or university or school. A .com, anyone can use. A .org used to be limited to nonprofit organizations. I find some hit and miss with that, so you can't always go by that. .net, you can see .name. Some of these are more common than others, but that can give you some clue, particularly .gov or .edu. But also just, is it authored by an organization, again, that you've heard of? Accuracy, so how accurate the information is. I'm giving you a brief overview, and then we're going to look at some actual websites. So that is, can you verify the information somewhere else? If you can't, if it sounds like, that sounds too good to be true, or I've never heard that before, it may be because it's not true. So can you verify it somewhere else? You can always double check. You find something on a website, it sounds kind of fishy, you've never heard that before. Search for just that information. See if you can find that somewhere else and verify it. The currency, that means how up to date is the information. Is there a date on it? Does it have really outdated information like statistics, or it references things from many, many years ago? It doesn't have the most up-to-date information. That's a bad sign when things have not been updated. If there are a lot of links on the page, links to other pages, and those links no longer work, that's a bad sign. That means that no one is really monitoring that page and updating things. So, those are some things to look for. The purpose of the website is very, very important. If they are trying to sell you something, regardless of what it is, I would be very suspicious, because when your motive is profit, it tends to skew the information that you include or don't include. If it is affiliated with a particular political party or religious organization, that can be very tricky. You may personally believe it, and that's a very different thing from should you use it in your essay, because an essay is about convincing the reader of what you're trying to say. So if it's going to seem biased, if it's a news organization or a religiously affiliated website that has a pretty clear viewpoint, liberal, conservative, particular, again, religious persuasion, you may 100% agree with it, as I said, but if it's going to seem biased to your reader, you probably want to stray away from it, or stay away from it. So always think about what the website is trying to accomplish. Is it trying to recruit? Is it trying to sell? Is it mainly just reporting on information? That's very different than putting forth a particular opinion, right? So that's something to look for. Audience, is it geared toward children? Is it geared toward experts? Once I had a student who was looking for some information on a president, and he found this website that the information was accurate. It was factual information, but it was a website for elementary school students. And so he and I discussed, that's not going to look very credible when you say, according to Miss Nelson's homepage for her 4th grade class. Even though the information might be 100% accurate, when you use that in your essay, you're going to look childish because you're using a source intended for children. On the other hand, if you're using something that's intended for experts, like legal analysts or someone with a great deal of expert knowledge on a topic, it's unlikely that an average reader is going to be able to understand it the way it was written if you quote it. So again, thinking about who this website was intended for is something to consider. And it may not be, again, that the information is good or bad necessarily, but it may be should I use this or not? This Boston College website also talks about coverage. So, how in depth does it go? Is it very simplistic? Is this just information that the website has gathered from other places and compiled? That's what Wikipedia does, kind of. Or is it, a source? Okay. Is the website actually producing information or just pulling from what other people have said? The last thing on the Boston College page is they call it style and functionality. And this is actually what I want to kind of emphasize as a first check. You've probably heard don't judge a book by its cover. You should judge a website by how it looks. So what do the colors look like? How easy is it to get around? Are there a lot of distractions on the page? Like, are there a lot of ads? I mean, there's ads on pretty much every website, but do they interfere with your ability to read? Are they really obvious? And what kind of ads are there? If it's difficult to read, if it looks like an amateur designed it, then they probably did. And you want a website that is professionally designed. So that can be a good first check. It's just, how does it look? Unfortunately, that's not enough, because now there are all these tools available that even someone who knows nothing about web design can punch in the information, choose a template, and the website looks really professional, but the information is not. So, but it is a good way to start. So I want to pull up some websites here, and I've picked out 3 that all have to do with homelessness. And I just want to show you a few of these tips in action. So one I pulled up is the National Coalition for the Homeless, which is an organization I've never heard of. It could be legitimate. It could be completely made up. It could be someone who was bored and sitting at home and made up the name and is trying to get people to donate money. I have no idea. But this is a page on their website. This is eHow, which you may have heard of. There's a lot of websites like this. WikiHow, things like that. Kind of these very general overviews of topics on the internet. So I chose that. And then the last one I want to look at is this squidoo.com culture. It's the culture section. And these all have to do with why people are homeless. So some things to point out why I would maybe use this website or not. Since I'm on this page, the Squidoo, here's one thing to consider. Again, you're going to have to acknowledge where your information came from. If you don't, that's plagiarism. So in my essay, I would have to say, according to squidoo.com. Regardless of how accurate this information is, it doesn't sound very credible. Compare that to, according to the National Coalition for the Homeless. Again, that could be completely made up. But just on how it sounds in my essay, I'm going to be reluctant to use squidoo.com. Maybe that may be superficial, it may seem shallow, but that is a consideration. So just that can be one thing you can think of. The other thing is there is an author here, there is a person's name. So on the one hand you think, well, that's a good thing, there's someone's name. I don't know who this person is. To be very honest, this photograph does not look like a professional photograph to me. It looks like someone just took a selfie. So that's going to make me nervous. There's ads on every website. So the fact that there are ads here don't bother me as much as it's kind of hard to tell what the ads are and what the content is. And that's a tricky thing and that's on purpose, because it's like, well, I don't know if I'm clicking on an article, am I clicking on an ad, what is this stuff? And so that's going to make me a little bit hesitant to use this. Even though a lot of this information may be very, very accurate, there are things on the page that make me nervous, right? Same thing with the eHow. I'm going to have to say in my essay, according to EHOW, which does not sound all that professional and credible. Notice the entire background of this page is a Bank of America ad. It's not just a Bank of America ad here or here. It's the entire background of the page. Okay? Again, there are ads kind of mixed in. Debt relief assistance right in the middle of this section on homelessness. So these are the kinds of things that, even though this information may be true, like they say most people think about homelessness with urban life, like cities, there are many homeless people in rural areas. I mean, that's a very good point. It's very generic though. There's really nothing that I couldn't find, that I could find that information somewhere else that's going to not sound as questionable as EHOW. All right. So those kind of things. Now, National Coalition for the Homeless, just from a visual standpoint, notice there's not a lot of ads. There's a few, I think, but there's not very many. It's pretty clean, easy to look at. There is a date that's a little bit outdated at this point, but not horribly bad. When I scroll down, there are citations, which makes me feel pretty good. And if I were going to really consider using this, I would probably check some of these links and see if they still work. But this is a very good sign. The other thing that I do for organization websites is look for an About Us section. Usually it's over here on the left or at the top. And that, if there is none, that's not a good sign. The other thing is, once you click on About Us, what information does it give you? This gives me some, again, this could all be made up, but they at least went to the effort to make it up. But on here, notice there's an address. There's a link here to actually look at who works there. This particular one has IRS forms as recent as 2012. So all these things, even though I've never heard of this organization, are going to make me much more likely to use this. Because I'm not going to be as nervous about how it's going to make me look or whether or not the information is credible. So it's a really difficult decision to make. Once you do more of your own research and you get more comfortable with it, you develop some kind of gut instinct. That takes a long time. So my recommendation to you, and this is how I'll end the tutorial, is use the databases, first of all. Use websites that you know what they are. Use New York Times, use PBS, use, government websites that you have heard of, so then you don't have to worry about it. Use some of these basic tips. Again, you can just type in how to evaluate websites and you'll find dozens of resources. If you're ever unsure, you can send me a link to a website if you want me to take a look. Use a really, really strict set of critical thinking skills. Have a really strong BS detector. And just be very, very skeptical. If it looks too good to be true, if it looks immature, if it looks juvenile, if it looks like an amateur did it, they probably did. And I would shy away from it. Okay. That will end this tutorial. Again, if you have any questions about sources, you can consult the other videos as they might answer your question, or you can always come see me or email me with any questions.